everyone. So this is, I hope, the asynchronous video for class 4. I just recorded one of these and didn't realize till it was saving that I talked for 50 minutes, nearly an hour. So that won't do. So I'm going to try again and apologize in advance that I may go a little quicker over some things, but that's what happens when you're trying to cover 2 genres in 1 week. So I just really want to make sure that you all read the chapters from cover to cover, because basically because of the timing of the last video, I'm going to cut out a lot of stuff that is already partly covered in that book. So here we are looking at both traditional literature and poetry. And really the main reason I've put them both in the same week is because both of them are best enjoyed orally, as in you are, listening to them. Traditional literature because it comes from the oral tradition, from storytellers who hone their craft and have specific ways of telling the stories that they tell. And poets because, of course, the sound of the words in a poem is very important. But in poetry also, how the words look on the page is also important. So, especially in poetry, you need to have white space around the poem and between the lines. And we'll talk about that a little later, why that is. So, traditional literature, and in our case, folk tales, because we read 2 folk tales for this week. Traditional literature is anything that has been passed down orally over many years and was eventually written down, and yet still continues to be told, and each time it's told it may change a little bit, and that is what makes it traditional literature, part of the oral tradition. So when you think about these stories, which are the earliest texts that we have in children's literature, it's helpful to think about how they might have started. No matter what continent they're from, these are stories that would have been told, thousands, tens of thousands of years ago. So before there was any kind of written language, before there were metal tools, etc. So if you think about it, people were very much dependent on sunlight. So after the sun sets, they can't do any of their work, so they gather around a fire, generally after they've eaten their last meal of the day, and tell stories. So this would be predominantly adults, maybe a few children who are older, because the younger ones are probably already asleep. So these people are sitting around their fire and taking turns telling stories. Some people prefer to tell scary stories. Some prefer to tell funny stories. Some tell stories of heroes. Some tell stories in which there are magical characters. And some of them will tell stories that are cautionary tales. And those may particularly be for the children who are listening and starting to fall asleep. In a folk tale or anything in the oral tradition, there's usually an element of predictability, so some sort of repetition, which allows the audience to participate and help the storyteller along. The characters have to be characters that those particular people sitting around that fire can identify with. And very often there's a story about some sort of an underdog, someone who is a little bit beleaguered in some way or another and gets the better of a person or animal who is higher up on the food chain, let's say, or on the social or the caste system. So if you think about it, this tradition seems to somehow be in our DNA, because once television existed, for example, that time after dinner became known as prime time. And the sorts of stories that were told were scary stories or funny stories, stories about heroes like policemen, doctors, firefighters, stories about people who seem ordinary but are able to do extraordinary things and get the better of a villain of some sort who appears at first to be stronger than they are. And again, like the stories around the campfire, there's an element of predictability. There's a central character who the people watching will find especially appealing. And of course, the stories have to be entertaining. Otherwise, in the case of TV, they're going to be canceled. And the other thing to remember is that these stories are not necessarily supposed to have a moral. There is one kind of story, a fable, that specifically has a moral at the end. But in general, these are stories that are told to entertain. And that is also what they are when they appear in children's literature. When you read Katie Horning's chapter on traditional literature, you'll see her breakdown of all of these kinds of forms, and so I just want to point out that there are many. And as it happens, what we looked at in the readings for this week were two folk tales, one of which could also be classified as a fairy tale because it has an element of magic, which would be the Cinderella stories. Although in some cultures there isn't an element of magic, it is an older character. Instead of a fairy godmother, it's an older character who is helpful. In Mrs. Chicken, of course, Mrs. Chicken is a trickster because Mrs. Crocodile is very much higher up on the food chain. And Mrs. Trickster is also a noodlehead, a different kind of story in which the main character is silly or fool or vain or something. So you think, for instance, about the Amelia Bedelia stories. Those would be noodlehead stories. When you think about using traditional literature in the classroom, there are some particular ways where it can become useful. And if you read different versions of the same story form in the way that they're all put together in Glass Slipper Gold Sandal, is that what it is, or is it the other way around? Yeah, Glass Slipper Gold Sandal. But there are also standalone books, many standalone books, which tell basically the same tale, but as collected in different countries. So by reading these different variations, this can become a story prompt to someone to write their own story of the same type, but with some sort of variation. And one thing that's especially popular is to share fractured folk tales or fairy tales. So, for example, when Deborah and I do our book talks, we'll show you a couple of traditional folk tales which a picture book artist has updated in some way or has turned the tale on its head in another way. So again, that sort of thing is a great way to encourage children to do their own writing and take a story and, for instance, set it in their neighborhood or their family in some way. Also, traditional literature lends itself extremely well to readers' theater. So I'm going to zip along here and talk about the people who created the books that we read for today. So starting with Mrs. Chicken and the Hungry Crocodile, this is one of the many picture books in which a single story collected from a specific place is put into the picture book format. In other words, approximately 32 pages, and set up in a way in which it's not just the sort of story you would hear told with that sort of repetition that you want, but it's also been put into book form in a way that gives yourself that suspense for turning pages. Warren Liddy Pay and Margaret Lippert wrote this story together. It was originally collected by Warren Liddy Pay from his own area. He grew up in Liberia, in Capita. His family were farmers, and they were also storytellers, which in that region are called Tio Kermen. And Warren Liddy Pay was also in Liberia before he moved to the U.S., was an award-winning theater director as well. Again, traditional literature lends itself very well to theater, too. He also has founded something called the Tio Tio Artists Workshop. So it trains young people to become Tio Kermen, traditional storytellers. He moved to Seattle in 1990, and that's where he met Margaret Lippert, who was working as a teacher and also a storyteller. And the other thing you should know is that Warren Liddy Pay now lives in Connecticut, and definitely check out his website, because he does school visits, and the way they're described on his website, they sound really terrific. And then a little more about Margaret Lippert, born in 1942 in Philadelphia. She was raised in England in an Irish family, where she learned a lot of traditional Irish and English stories. She moved to the U.S., graduated from Swarthmore, and then did a lot of traveling. She spent a year in Tanzania, a year in Guatemala, and each place she went, she would learn that language, which of course helped her in collecting stories, which she would then tell herself. She got a doctorate from Teachers College, worked as an elementary school teacher and an elementary school principal, and later a professor of children's literature. Her first book was written in 1980, and she's done about 21 books so far, and I believe all of them are picture book folklore stories. And the illustrator of this book, Julie Pashkis, was also the illustrator for the other folktale we're reading this week, Glass Slipper, Gold Sandal. So a little bit about Julie Pashkis. Here is another book, another story that Margaret Lippert and Warren Liddy Pay collaborated on, and that was also illustrated by Julie Pashkis. So again, it's a story from Liberia, which is, of course, where Warren Liddy Pay is from. Julie Pashkis was born in Pennsylvania in 1957. She studied in Norway and went to Cornell University, and later got a BFA at the School for American Craftsmen. And she's taught art to children, and in 1991 she quit teaching to concentrate on her own paintings and illustrations. Here's another book that she illustrated, happens to be a poetry book by Janet Wong, of course, Janet Wong, who is a really good poet and has written a number of picture books that are in verse. Her style, the fact that she lived in Norway, studied in Norway, is very interesting to me, because if you know anything about Norwegian folk art, you will definitely see elements of that in some of the paintings in Glass Slipper, Gold Sandal. So she has a very folk arty style, but she's also able to change it for each book that she illustrates. She has said that she likes painting because it lets her wander without a destination. And she likes making picture books because she says a picture book is a 32-page painting in service to the story and characters of the book. So she sees illustration as painting with a destination, and the paintings that she creates outside of illustration as paintings without destinations. If you're going to introduce a book like Glass Slipper, Gold Sandal, I think it would be very important to make sure that everyone in your class is already familiar with the basic Cinderella story. And so I would assume that the best way to do that would be to look up one of the Cinderella stories and tell it to the class, or perhaps read one of the many standalone picture books with a Cinderella story in it. Another thing I want to mention about folklore like this, where you really can see that there are stories that are really similar that popped up seemingly at the same time all over the world. And folklore scholars, I think, have a fascinating job, because one thing they do is they look for hints about folk tales and where they were told. And recent scholarship shows that they think that some of these story types that appear in different places may have started in the Silk Route, the early trading route that went from Asia through Europe, etc., etc. And of course, once again, there would be travelers who are stopping at the same place on the route. They have a fire, they sit around together and tell stories. And so that way, one kind of story may be told by someone about the sorts of animals that are in their country. And then when that story is brought home by someone else, they will change it a little bit so that it includes the animals that exist where they live. And a little bit about sort of the timeline of traditional literature. When you think about the fact that it's from the oral tradition, it's very difficult to know where anything really began. But think about Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. Recent scholarship believes that those are stories that were frequently told orally, and Homer set them to his own verse and wrote them down. And so Homer's versions of those stories have been passed on. And that was around 700 to 800 BCE. And then a little bit later, Aesop, around 600 BCE, did the same thing. He heard various stories, he wrote them down himself and turned them into short tales that were fables, where he put a particular moral at the end. In China, books began being printed around 800 the CE, Common Era, which is also around the same time that the first mention of a character known as Mother Goose is told. So anything that's a Mother Goose story is really something that was told by a storyteller. And it became common as a storyteller to say, this story was told to me by Mother Goose, for instance. And there are many people who claim to know who was the real Mother Goose, but really nobody does. In Germany, the printing press came around 1440, and so that began, again, having some of these oral stories being put into print. So Charles Perrault in France, in the late 17th century, collected some stories that were printed, and about 100 years later, the Grimm brothers in Germany also went around collecting stories and then having them printed, their own versions printed. Nowadays, there are folklore scholars, and the best known are Iona and Peter Opie. And so if you're especially interested in the origins of folk tales, fairy tales, definitely check out the Opie's work. Now, moving on to poetry. So we have two books here. We have Poetries, and of course this one opens very differently, and there's a good reason for it to open that way. It's not just a gimmick. So you can talk about that in your groups. And I want to say a little bit about using poems in school as well. Poetry, of course, is an important part of any curriculum, and there are some great anthologies available. And of course, there are plenty of poems written for adults that also work for children, and those could be used. But especially popular in schools are some of the funny poems, for instance, by Shel Silverstein and Jack Perlutsky. If you don't know of them already, I would definitely look them up and check out their stories. But I think it's important to go beyond those really funny stories and to explore books that are more sort of free verse. So rhyming is great for when you're listening to poems, rhyming and rhythm. But if your children are trying to write poems, trying to stick to a meter and a rhyme can be quite frustrating. So if you're able to share free verse, that's the kind of poetry that children are much more able to and eager to try out for themselves. There's an awful lot out there about poetry and about how it can be used in a classroom. And Deborah is going to do her own video for us because she herself knows a lot about poetry in general and has some of her own favorites of poetry that's been written for children. I am also going to refer you to a blog post that I put together a few years back, which talks specifically about why reading poetry in the classroom is good for fluency, for phonemic awareness, and for comprehension. So I'll put a link to that below too. So on to the book creators, the poetry book creators. So we read the book by Douglas Florian. This is one of many poetry books he's done in which he's written poems on a particular theme. So another one of those, for example, is this one, Insectolopedia, which is, of course, poems about insects. And you'll see that he has a very distinctive style when he illustrates his poetry. He tends to work on like old paper bags that he unfolds and paints on. He uses crayons a lot. He uses a lot of different mediums. And he will do collage as well, and often have books that have a die cut in them, a little hole where you can see through to the other page. Florian he grew up in New York City. He's also known as a fine artist, not just a poet and artist for children. And he is really critically acclaimed in the children's book world, but as far as I know, he's never won any major awards. Oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you about Paul Fleischman, who put together Glass Slipper Gold Sandal. Paul Fleischman, his father was Sid Fleischman, a well-known children's book writer who won the Newbery Medal, and his son Paul Fleischman has also won the Newbery for this book, Joyful Noise, which is not folklore this time, but it's poems for two voices. So poems that are written so that two children can read them simultaneously. And so there will be some lines that show that one person reads, and then there'll be lines right together, so both children would read their own lines at that point, etc., etc. It's much easier to see what I mean here. So, for instance, here's one about honeybees. So you can see they speak together, then solo, 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 then together a little bit more, etc. Okay, sorry. That was a little patch, which I don't think I'll be able to edit into where it goes, but you know how it is. You got the information now. And then the other book we read for today, not necessarily the whole thing, but definitely the introduction and the back matter, and take a look through it, because it covers so many different poetic forms. And this was collected by Paul Ginesco, who is himself a poet, but he's probably better known as an anthologist of poetry for kids. He himself is a high school English teacher. He did his first anthology way back in 1977, and at this point he's done about 25 anthologies. Every once in a while he'll include one of his own poems, which is a little unusual. Usually anthologists who are poets take the opportunity to include several of their own. And Ginesco also does a lot of teacher workshops as well. He's done a few of these books that are this kind of square format with a lot of poems in there, and illustrated by a well-known illustrator. Here's one he did that is very short poems, illustrated by Melissa Sweet. He's got another one that is just concrete poems, which if you've looked through this book enough, you'll know what kind of poem that is. And then the illustrator for A Kick in the Head is Chris Roshka, who's become very well known. He actually got a Caldecott honor for his second book, which has become very well known, Yo Yes. So again, it's sort of a two voices book. It's all conversation between two kids who end up becoming friends, but they're both quite shy at the beginning. A great read aloud, in which the illustrations, of course, fill in all of the characterization. So a little more about Chris Roshka. Born in 1959, he always loved to draw, but he actually majored in biology in college, and is also became a professionally trained violist. But he's especially loves jazz. So a number of his books have a jazz theme. His very first book was in 1992, the year before Yo Yes, and that was Charlie Parker Played Bebop. Again, another book with a terrific kind of a rhythm to it. And if you know I'm trying to save time here. You get me started talking about jazz and I won't shut up either. Anyway, he's won a number of Caldecott medals and Caldecott honors. And in 2016, he actually was chosen by Vera B. Williams to finish her last book. So when she realized she was dying, she asked Chris to come and work with her on her book. And so they worked together on the book Dummy and discussing how Chris would illustrate her text. So that's it for what you're reading for today, but I wanted to talk about one more person whose books are now completely buried in this pile here. Let's see if I can find them. There we go. Okay, so for Class 5, you will be reading Joey Pigza Swallowed the Key by Jack Cantos. But I had also asked you to, if you possibly could find the time, to read this book here. I'm trying to find the piece of paper where I've got all my Jack Cantos information. Jack Cantos is going to be visiting us, Class 5, which is in 2 weeks. But he wasn't able to come that week, so it's kind of amazing that we got him, because he's a very sought-after speaker, and you'll realize why when he comes. He's very funny, very, very dry and funny. He's had a fascinating life. In fact, I've got much more than I'm going to be able to tell you about him. But the bullet points would be he was born in 1951 in Pennsylvania. His family moved around a lot, not just in the U.S., but also Barbados. They lived in Pennsylvania, Florida, Puerto Rico. Let's see, in 6th grade, he read his sister's diary, which of course she was trying to keep a total secret. And he decided that he thought he could read better than she could. This was his older sister. And so at that point, he really wanted to become a writer, and he started reading and reading and reading. However, he was always kind of a troublemaker in school. He was always drawn to the kids who were the class clowns or the troublemakers, or the kids who couldn't sit still, because they just felt they were the more interesting kids. They were more fun. And the books he writes now, all of them are about kind of mischievous characters who get into trouble, but deep down they're really good kids. And the first books he had published were picture books about Rotten Ralph, who's this bright red cat here. They're illustrated by Nicole Bruel, who in fact was a classmate of his at Emerson when he was in college. And again, Rotten Ralph, as you can probably tell from his name, is not the world's most cooperative and nice cat. Another thing about Jack Cantos is that he decided that he really wanted to go to college, but his family did not by any means have the money for that. And of course, he'd been such a troublemaker in school, he was not going to get a scholarship. So right after he graduated from high school, he got a job that paid really well, and his plan was to use that money to go to college. Unfortunately, the job was smuggling drugs, and he did get caught, and he ended up spending time in prison. And this is one of his books that he wrote for young adults, which is about his time in prison, A Hole in My Life. This is actually his mugshot. And let's see, he won the Newbery Medal finally for Dead End in Norvelt. And he's just uniformly admired as a writer for children. And he's written, he's run the gamut. He's written horror, it's like for young adults, and sort of semi-autobiographical memoir books. And then, of course, the Joey Pigza series, of which there are 5 books. And then he has also the Jack books. I can't remember Jack's last name. Jack is a little younger than Joey, so those books are for sort of mid to upper elementary school, whereas Joey Pigza is sort of right on the border between elementary and middle school. One thing to know is that Joey Pigza was was published in 1998, and Jack, he based Joey Pigza on a particular kid who he saw during a school visit. And then he went on to really do a lot of research about ADHD, talked to a lot of doctors. So the book actually reflects very well what was considered good treatment of ADHD at that time. Now, it's true that some of the things that are done in this book are maybe not what is still considered standard treatment, but there's absolutely no question that Joey is an incredibly engaging character, that the children who read the Joey books just really fall in love with him as a character, whether or not they have any knowledge themselves or of classmates with ADHD. So, the last thing I want to say is, this is going to seem a little irregular, but I know that we're all supposed to read Joey Pigza for the class in 2 weeks, but for any of you who have already read this, I would really like you to talk about it with the other people in your book discussion group, because I want everyone to know as much as they can about Jack Gantos and the kinds of books that he writes. And obviously that learning about the book from your classmates should not prevent you from also reading it from cover to cover before our 5th class. All right, so that's it. I'm pretty sure this video is about half the length of the other one, so I'll find out as soon as I hit stop. And I'll see you all in class.